Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
Brave New World is supported by the Center for Data Science, or CDS, at NYU. If your organization is interested in engaging with CDS through student projects, please email cdsindustry@nyu.edu. Hello and welcome to Brave New World. Please check out my newsletter on vasantdar.substack.com for more color on my podcasts and musings on issues of the day. Has the world become less or more safe over the years? This might seem like an odd question, but it's an important one that drives the insurance industry and financial markets. Joining me today on Brave New World is Neeti Bhalla Johnson, who is President of Global Risk Solutions for Liberty Mutual Insurance, where she heads the company's commercial and specialty insurance business unit, with operations all over the world. I expect we'll talk a lot about risk and specifically how someone running a large insurance company thinks about it. Neeti, welcome to Brave New World. I am delighted to have you on the show.
It's such a pleasure to be here, Vasant. Thank you for having me.
Tell us a little bit more about your journey until now, Neeti.
Yeah, so my origin story, I guess, starts. I'm Indian by background. I was born in Jalandhar, India, which is in the northern part of India. And when I was very young, about 2 years old, my dad moved to Kenya to seek fame and fortune. And so I spent probably the first 6 years of my life commuting, if you want to call it that, between Kenya and India, until finally, when I was about 8 or 9 years old, we decided to move hook, line, and sinker. By that point, it was myself and my 2 younger brothers with my mom. We moved to Kenya. So I grew up in Kenya. I actually generally think of Kenya as home before I think of India as home, and that's been my own personal identity journey, if you want to call it that, over the last few years. And so grew up in Kenya, went to college in Kenya, and then started my first job, if you want to call it that, at the Nairobi Stock Exchange, which was very nascent at the time. You can imagine we were seeing the rise of equity and debt capital markets in East Africa. This was in the 90s. And from there, I ended up going to the Central Bank of Kenya, worked there for a few years, and then had the great fortune to get a scholarship to go to Oxford and study there, where I then met my husband, and after that found my way to the investment banking world and worked at Goldman Sachs for almost 14 years. And then one day Liberty Mutual called and said, "Would you like to come over?" And I said, "Gosh, I'd never ever thought of insurance as a career path." And I have to admit, that's been my other journey over the last 9 years. So I've been at Liberty Mutual for about 9 years now. And it's been fascinating diving into the world of risk from the insurance side of the balance sheet, right? The liability side of the balance sheet versus the asset side, where I grew up was on the investing side of the world. Mm-hmm. So I moved to Liberty about 9 years ago, became the chief investment officer for a few years, and then about 16 months ago, moved over to the insurance side to run our commercial and specialty business, which is about a $20 billion gross premium business across 26 countries. We write everything from your workers' compensation for mid-sized businesses to large businesses, all the way to specialty insurance, which, you can think of it as aviation, marine, space, all sorts of cool things.
That's, really interesting, the gamut of risks that you insure against. On my way here, I was just thinking about The Sopranos,
Weird that your mind went there, but okay.
That, they go also in the risk and insurance business, but unlike you, they also impacted acts of God, if you didn't pay up. So, that just gave me a chuckle. But how has the world of risk and protection and all of that changed in the last decade? Because whenever I talk to people, they talk about, this is a time of great uncertainty and all of that stuff. But, when I look back at, history and just, the last century, 2 world wars, all kinds of things, including a pandemic,
And I wonder, are we actually, what's changed? Hasn't the world always been like that? Isn't this always a world of great uncertainty?
Yeah,
Or is something different?
it's interesting you say that, and I always think about the arc of time, right, and how as human beings we tend to extrapolate the more recent into the future, but it's helpful to take a step back once in a while and ask yourself, where are we in that general arc of history and in the arc of time? And so one of the books that for me was very impactful over the past decade or so was a book by Hans Rosling. I'm sure you've heard of it. Factfulness is what the book was called. And it was very much about, he effectively formulated 12 questions with 3 multiple choice answers to each of these. And he asked questions of around poverty, around education, around health, around freedom, around inequality, all the things that we would consider to add or detract from quality of life. And he asked all sorts of people these questions, business leaders, government leaders. He took it to Davos. He asked all sorts of. And what was fascinating was only about 17% of the people answered those questions correctly. And questions were around, do you think health has improved? By how much, right? And he gave sort of these multiple choice questions. And what I thought was really interesting was not so much, of course, we all know as we sit here today that the world is a better place than it was 100 years ago. It's a better place than it was 50 years ago. The interesting thing about this book is it's not that. It's the fact that we don't believe it. We actually think it's worse, right? As human beings, we actually believe the world is getting more dangerous, it's more volatile. And so if I reflect on your question, and I've been thinking about this a little bit, let's take kind of 2 or 3 things that for me really stand out in this. One is across every measure, life expectancy is better. Child mortality rates versus a century ago are better, right? Fertility rates are lower. So our concerns around, will there be this massive population boom that's going to create an issue? That's better. Global income inequality has actually gone down. Inequality within countries has gone up, but global income inequality has actually gone down. So you'd say you look at every fact-based measure, and the world is a better place. So why don't we feel that it is better? And this is where the question around regime changes comes into play. And you and I have talked a little bit about this in the past, which is there are psychological, intuitive reasons as to why human beings, I think, we're just generally, and Danny talks about this in his Fast Thinking, Slow Thinking book, right? Which is very much about our brains like simplification and categorization. So we dichotomize. That's one of the things Hans Rosling found, right? We like to put things into buckets, good or bad, right? Safe or unsafe, heroes or villains, right? Better or worse. And I think what we generally find is nothing is quite that dichotomized, right? It's very much about where are you on the spectrum. And we'll talk a little bit about this when it comes to risks, because I think we tend to think about things as this versus that, rather than let's hold 2 conflicting points of view in mind and then think about what are the fact-based things that will inform an outcome. So let me give you an example. So the nature of risk, right? Climate change as the example, which is a risk we think a lot about in the insurance industry. In the last 3 of the last 5 years, aggregate average industry events of impacting coming from climate change have been a lot worse. We've had more $100 billion plus industry events around catastrophes in the last 5 years than before. You would look at that and you would say, well, that must mean climate change is worse, right? It is the trend is worse. Yet you look at the past 10 years, look at the past 20 years, and you would say in that grand scheme of things, were the last 3 to 5 years the aberration, or was that the norm? And the question here becomes, in my mind, if we go back to this dichotomizing part of it, it is both things are true, i.e., climate is changing. The rate of change is accelerating, right? And at the same time, we have to sort of say, but the world isn't ending tomorrow. And so how do we start to think about both those things, which is at the margin, we have better infrastructure than we did 200 years ago. We are better prepared for some of these things, and yet we have to do many things differently from the way we do today in order to address the rate of change. And how do we address that? But if we simply catastrophize the whole thing and put those in these two kind of buckets, that's where you end up making bad policy decisions and you end up making bad choices, because you're effectively saying, let me take just the last 3 years and extrapolate them versus let me try to think about what does the rate of change imply. So we have to constantly ask ourselves, where are we in the arc of time and the arc of history? I think we generally tend to very much focus on the last 5 years or the last 10 years. And I think it's really important to take a longer term perspective, a longer term historical perspective, because at the end of the day, human beings are human beings. We vacillate between fear and greed, and we have to ultimately the choices that we make today that define our future tomorrow. So it's important to study history. And at the same time, think about relative to history and relative to where we are today, is the rate of change accelerating or decelerating? I would argue the rate of change is accelerating today, and the nature of risks are therefore shifting and becoming more integrated.
This is fascinating, but I'm curious, why is it accelerating? As you were talking, I couldn't help but think that, this whole climate risk is I'm guessing it's much more of a recent phenomenon, right? Like 40, 50 years ago, insurance companies were probably not, but again, I'm out of my depth here, that they weren't probably that concerned about climate risk as they are today. So I guess in terms of climate, things have gotten worse. In what ways have things gotten better, right? So if you look at sort of the balance of things, okay, so climate's gotten worse, cyber risks are new, right? They've emerged and they are likely to get worse before they get better. So if you sort of divide the world into sort of these two buckets, what's better, what's worse? Like how would you think about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. Your point about climate, and it's a good way to sort of, because you're doing exactly that. You're telling me dichotomize, and I will.
That's right.
Let's start with climate. So climate, you'd say, how much of it is we've all woken up to it versus we felt that we had a good handle on it, and then the data started to prove that maybe the way we had thought about modeling has shifted. We have very good, as an industry, as sort of broadly speaking, weather is one of the most studied things out there, and we have very good models that forecast things like hurricanes. And think about we are better off. So in your better bucket, I would say, as a society, we are better at understanding the path of hurricanes, where they're going to land, and getting ahead of it and mitigating things like removing people out of the path off, right? So we're better there.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that the catastrophe, when it strikes, isn't creating more damage, right? And so how do we think through that? So I'll give you two simple examples. In the insurance world, we talk a lot about frequency and severity of losses, right? So both of those things are true today. We are seeing unforeseen levels of frequency, right? And we're seeing a greater severity coming from each of those. So in 2021, this is one data point, Munich Re estimated that natural disasters globally have produced losses of about 280 billion. That's one number. Here's another number that's really important. Only 120 billion of those losses were insured losses. Now, why is that important? Because you and I have talked a little bit about there is a growing protection gap, coming back to your mafia analogy a little bit. There's a growing protection gap that we all have to recognize. So this starts from one, do we believe that the ability for people, for businesses to transfer risks to other balance sheets is an important mechanism that has allowed economic development to happen? The answer to that is yes, right? That's insurance, basically, at its core. The question now becomes, over the last several decades, actually, you have seen insurance become more and more utilized, not only in developed economies, but also in developing countries, which is a good thing because that allows progress to happen, economic development, innovation to happen. However, if you believe that the frequency and the severity of losses coming from things like climate change, new perils like cyber, right? New innovations like digital assets that we don't yet know how to insure, what all that's going to lead to is this growing protection gap. Ultimately, that doesn't mean the losses go away. The losses are still there. So the question is, who bears them?
Right.
What's the economic cost of those losses? And who bears them ends up being the individual, the business, and frankly, governments, right? So if I go back to my Munich Re example, the 280 billion of losses, economic losses, 120 billion of those were insured. Where did the other 160 billion go? Because reconstruction still has to happen.
Right. And what were the impacts of that? Did people go under? What sort of cascades?
That's exactly right. And so that's the way I would say. So what I would say to you is the pandemic was another classic example. So I would say even within each episode, within climate, there are things that have gotten better, like our ability to model some of these things, right? But the trends in the underlying weather are shifting, so we have to stay ahead of that. So within the pandemic, there were things that innovation was amazing, the speed at which we got the vaccines, right? And yet the ability to cover business interruption that resulted from the pandemic, fully the close to $1 trillion of insurance capital that is out there, right, would not have covered the scale and the scope of business interruption.
Yeah.
Would it have happened, right? Cyber is the same thing. So I'd say within each area, there are things that I would point to say they make us better because we have the ability to think through this. And yet at the same time, our ability to continue to close that protection gap as a society is going to be critical.
So what will it take?
Is there a short answer to this? Like at some level, what will it take between insurance companies, regulators, policymakers? What's required?
So the short answer is it's going to take coordination. It's going to take a strategic focus like everything else. And it's going to take us all to say we need to come together and agree that we're all here to solve this. It's like the space race.
Yeah.
Right?
No, I mean, it's like, risks have gone from being local to being global,
That's
right?
it. And they've gone from being siloed to integrated, right? And they've gone from being where you could effectively think about what the aggregation risk is and put a price on it to saying, I don't actually know how cyber risk aggregates. How does it aggregate? I don't know yet. What does a systemic failure look like?
Yeah,
right?
we haven't seen that yet.
We haven't seen that yet.
Yeah.
And so what's it going to take? It does take coordination and it takes prioritization like anything else in life. And it takes a different way of doing things. I don't think we have quite attacked this as a concerted priority.
Yeah,
we talk about it.
Yeah, I can see why you would choose acceleration as a descriptor of this, because climate-wise, the frequency, severity. You mentioned two other things. Maybe we should sort of dive into those. You talked about geopolitical volatility and digital assets, the whole digital thing, which I want to talk to actually, because I find that space fascinating. But in terms of like geopolitical volatility, so what's happening in the UK at the moment, right? It's a bit of a disaster. And I think that's also sort of an indication of this connection between politics and risk, which the financial markets, alert us to. So when you talk about geopolitical volatility, define that a little bit more. Are you just talking about more frequent regime changes among leaders? Are you talking about political leaders becoming emboldened to do all kinds of things that create both local and global problems? What are you getting at with this whole notion of geopolitical volatility?
I'm smiling because...
And how does it show up in your business would be my next question.
I'm smiling because geopolitical volatility is one of those things where the way I'm defining it is, do we think the likelihood of political and economic sort of wars, if you want to call it that, are likely to escalate or de-escalate? That's the way I generally think about that. And I smile because there's one of my favorite charts And I wrote this note down because I thought it was such an interesting statistic. One of my favorite charts is a chart by Max Roser, and he plots from 1500 to 2015. So talk about the arc of history. He plots the percent of years in which the great powers of each time, right, were fighting with one another.
Yeah.
I thought it was a really cool chart. And what it looks at is, so it's interesting that for the first time ever, pre-Russia, Ukraine, there had been no war or conflict in Western Europe in 3 generations, right? Before Russia, Ukraine happened. Prior to that, 50% or more of the times you had 2 powers fighting each other in some form or fashion, right? So when you think about, therefore, the world we lived in to where, let's say, the last post-World War period was the last 50 years, we've actually, yes, we've had, the Gulf War and all of that, but it's been generally no big powers going to battle, right? It's been a period of really great stability. And there's a great book written by Graham Allison, who's at the Harvard Kennedy School, where it's called Destined for War. And he talks about, he went back and studied, he said, go back in time and look at every time a rising power threatened an incumbent power, right? In this case, let's call China the rising power and call the US the incumbent power. Every time a rising power threatened an incumbent power, how many times did that result in war? How many times did it resolve itself amicably? And the overwhelming majority was, it was resolved through war, right? So when I talk about geopolitical volatility, what I mean is, let's think about all kind of the threat actors today, right? Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, the Middle East, right? This is before I then start to talk about cyber threat actors, right? Which can be politically motivated or not politically motivated. You can talk about tech companies and ethical AI, right? In terms of how do we think about that? So generally, when I take the UK you mentioned, Brexit is only about 6 years old at this point, right? In the grand scheme of things, the EU is only about 22 years old at this point. So again, in the grand scheme of things, we are seeing the velocity, again, if I speak to the frequency of the types of things that can be destabilizing, right? We're just seeing more of those over the last several years. So the question now becomes, what do you do about that? As you said, as a company dealing, sort of underwriting risk for a living and having to price risk today for something that, we don't know how it plays out in the future. How do you do that? I would say you have to make you have to have a sort of a certain point of view with respect to what are some of your core beliefs about that future. So one of those core beliefs is very much, like I said, believe that business models, geopolitical models are shifting, right? We're in a transition phase. Transitions by their very nature tend to create disequilibrium. So we all have to be clear about that. On the other hand, what has been the stabilizing force over the last 50 years? It's been the U.S. hegemony in some ways, right? It's been sort of the U.S. as as sort of providing that resilience overall. At the same time, what has led to stability, again, in my humble opinion, would be that we have seen more of the world rise out of poverty. We have seen, right, that grand arc that I was talking about. So generally, we're sitting here today with the largest global middle class that we've ever seen. So the opportunity cost of going to war is greater, right? Because there's more to lose overall. So as we sit here today, in my mind, those are the 2 key things we have that I spend a lot of time in the context of geopolitics thinking about.
So where are we in this evolution with respect to, let's say, cyber? Because you've mentioned cybercrime, which is on the rise. I'm assuming you've got some data. So where are we in the in that evolution of cybercrime?
Yeah, it's interesting. There was a McAfee report that was released that said cybercrime is going to cost the global economy up to $1 trillion.
Wow. And you were talking about 280 billion, as weather. So this is like
right?
3.5 times that.
So
Yeah.
this that 280 billion was just for 2021, exactly to your point. What's interesting, therefore, is if you look at that and you say the average ransomware breach cost, right? Every time there was a ransomware breach, the cost of that was about $5 million on average, right? By the way, there's certain industries that are particularly targeted, like healthcare, right? Where that cost is actually greater. So the way I would answer your question is, all the things we get excited about, IoT, right? The Internet of Things, think about how quickly post-COVID, we've become more interconnected, more digital, not less. Those are all positive progress things for humanity. The question now becomes our ability to actually price for those risks and understand. Well, first it starts with understanding those risks and pricing them. So what I would say is it goes back to good old-fashioned things. Let's simplify it. Was it harder to provide auto insurance before seatbelts and airbags? Yes, it was. Right?
Yeah.
Is it a different product today because safety has improved? Yes, it is. It's as simple as, I'm oversimplifying, but effectively, to make something insurable, you have to effectively say to yourself, can we think about improving hygiene, which is why, and safety, right? Which is why I keep coming back to, I get excited about being in an industry where I fundamentally believe we have a purpose to serve in not only then providing coverages, but actually helping improve that safety and hygiene side of things. So in cyber, as an example, why is healthcare the most targeted? Because the healthcare systems, right, are some of the most dated, right? Yeah. Why is the electric grid?
And I guess the information is also valuable.
And the information is extremely valuable. That's exactly right. So you've got weak systems with highly valuable information.
Right.
That's
soft targets.
Soft targets, exactly. Which is why the electric grid becomes one of the key kind of 5 risks that I think Michael Lewis put in his 5th risk element book, right? Where he talks about, well, how do we think about the vulnerability there? So I would say it's very much, we're on that continuum today as a society, as an industry, to say, to make cyber insurable, you have to think about how do you increase the pre-insurance health and assessment of it. And then the post-breach, how do you make sure that you can get in there and do something that enables you to put businesses back to work faster? So like anything, there's no one silver bullet. It is really going to become about very much around, do we start to think about cyber safety the way we think about auto safety, the way we think about, employee safety, and what there's a cost to that needs to be shared by the system as a whole.
So as you were talking about the healthcare industry, I couldn't but think that the nature of risk has changed, right? Maybe it used to be more like malpractice and, things like that. And now it's like, cyber and breaches and stuff like that. And I can imagine that this is true in other industries as well, right? Cyber risk is pretty generic. We talked about this notion of passing the risk to another actor so you can focus on the business. Are you finding businesses trying to sort of somehow bundle their risks and say, just insure me for anything bad? I don't know what that bad stuff is going to be, but just insure me for that. So are you seeing sort of more of this desire to just bundle these large unknowns as opposed to sort of seek them individually?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say yes and no. And what I mean by that is there's sort of the question of how does the client, the customer, want to buy, right? And that's partly driven by the nature of risks that each industry and business faces, not just today, but how they may be thinking about how their business model needs to evolve to stay competitive, and therefore the kinds of risk mitigation policies that they may need. So I'll come back to that in a minute. At the same time, the insurance industry and the way people have wanted to buy things because of ease of buying, there have been risks that have been bundled together before, which we may need to unbundle as we sit here today, because you can no longer price them appropriately as a package. So that's why I say yes and no. And so let's take
some
both.
things are going the other way.
So let's kind of take each of those as I'll give you one example on each. There are large multinational clients today who would say, when I look at my total cost of risk and how much therefore I want to spend on insuring those, there are three fundamental shifts that the risk managers in those large companies are looking at, right? One is they're sort of suddenly, as a risk manager, not only effectively being asked to think about understanding the nature of risks that come with the company's business model, right? Fire, business interruption, cyber, right? All of those things. They're also, in some instances, being asked to think about, but are models shifting? Take any large package delivery, UPS, FedEx, right? Amazon, take any of these folks. And you could say, as they sit here today, they all have to be thinking about, one, how is technology impacting my business model going forward? Two, how will things like alternative fuels impact, right? My delivery trucks. Suddenly, a delivery truck that is battery powered is a different fire hazard, for example, right? Than your traditional internal combustion engine. That's a different risk that you're insuring. And so the perils become very, very different, right? And how you think about them. Some of those clients may very well say to you, I don't know, given I'm now looking at this interconnected web of risks and all of that, I don't know how much coverage I need and where specifically I need it. I want to be able to buy a portfolio of risks. So can you just, hence a big question and rise around parametric insurance as an example, right? Because ultimately, what is insurance? It's a promise to pay. And when you buy insurance, you hope that what you covered, what the peril or the hazard you were looking to cover was appropriately covered and that you are going to get paid for the loss that you incurred. And so you are absolutely seeing, therefore, a shift in certain companies, in certain risk managers' jobs, where they have to think very deeply about, I don't know where the risk is going to come from. Can you make this simpler for me? Because otherwise I may be looking at buying 40 different products and I still don't know whether I have appropriate coverage or not. And can I buy them bundled? Can I not? So there's that one example, right? As one. Now let's come to the one where it's potentially been bundled. They need to be unbundled. And I'm using the words bundled quite loosely because they mean something very specific in certain parts of the industry. So take catastrophe reinsurance, just as an example, right? Generally, like in the investing markets, like in the equity market, people are more inclined to give you more coverage for things when pricing is soft and they're looking to grow, right? When volatility feels low, when you haven't had losses in a while, you're more likely to say, yeah, and I'll throw this in, and I'll throw this in, and I'll throw this in, right? And let's quote you one price.
Right.
And then as the losses go up, as the volatility turns, as capital starts to withdraw itself, just like in the asset markets, people start to say, wait, maybe I've thrown too many things together. Maybe now I need to think about unbundling this. So this is literally, as we sit here today, post Hurricane Ian in Florida, there are deep questions being asked about, one, will there be sufficient reinsurance capacity for people to be able to insure natural catastrophes? And secondly, there are fundamental questions that reinsurers are now asking themselves. They're actually opening up a bunch of their contracts and saying, I may have bundled too many things in here, right? I may have thrown too many things in here. And I need to now start to think about single peril versus multiple peril. I need to think about how long does the coverage persist post an event? And so a long answer to what you probably thought was a very straightforward question, but I would say it's both. And so it depends. And I think fundamentally, this is where data and the ability to draw insights and the ability to price products in a different way, and then the ability to securitize those products, right? Think about mortgages 30 years ago. the ability to securitize mortgages fundamentally changed the nature of that industry because you suddenly were able to draw in a bigger pool of capital to diversify the risk across, right?
Yeah.
Those are some of the things we are going to need to see and continue to look at as we look at sort of that growing protection gap.
Right, right. So, I mean, this is a good segue into the challenges you face in running an organization like yours, right? So, we've been talking about sort of the environment and risks and pricing. Let's talk a little bit about sort of the biggest challenges you face in running a business like this, where you're insuring, pretty much everything under the sun, right? You've talked about all of these Rumsfeldian unknowns. You've got these thousands, maybe tens of thousands of underwriters, who are constantly like poring over data, figuring out how to price things. You probably have another bunch of people, talking to people about how to securitize these things and get them off your balance sheet. So what are the biggest challenges you face internally in running an organization like this?
If I was to oversimplify, I would put them all under the heading of cultural. And what I mean by that effectively, right? If you said everything we've talked about, right, would say the way you select risks, the way you price risks, the way you think about the backward-looking versus forward-looking view of risk, the way you think about the integrated nature of risk, all of those things. We just touched a little bit earlier on. How do you think about the interface between human judgment and the speed of being able to use data and analytics to inform things, right? This was the conversation you had with Danny Kahneman around noise, which was around where can you apply tools where you can absolutely think about a predictable outcome, and therefore you can throw models at it. All of those things, right, that I've just touched upon. At the end of the day, people matter, right? And ultimately it's a people business. It's a relationship business. So I would say the biggest effective challenge that as I sit here today in thinking about, and this isn't just true for insurance companies, I would argue. I think this is really the fundamental challenge of our times as we think about industrial models, is generally, culturally, we have tended to lean much more on deep subject matter expertise, right? We've gone deeper and deeper. We've refined things further and further. We've segmented things deeper and deeper in a more granular way and created expertise along the way that has been fantastic. Along the way, a skill that's hasn't always been prioritized has been the ability to look across and connect dots. And so I call it, in my very simple way, we're shifting from a world where just the micro mattered to where the macro and the micro matter. Yeah. Right? Mm-hmm. And culturally, the way we have trained people, culturally, the way we have valued leadership and what we valued as traits of leadership and valued as traits of success have been very much around specialization. Mm-hmm. Again, not to fall into the trap of dichotomizing, specialization is good. And it is really important for people to be able to also look up and break silos and look across and be able to connect and see things across the board. So I would say the cultural challenge as we sit here today is very much around how do you get underwriters, some of whom really feel that pricing is the only tool they have, to really understand that actually selection is going to matter a lot more. Mm-hmm. So how you think about segmenting cyber as an example, what's a good business versus a bad business? And that's not to say good versus bad business. It's more, what's a good risk? What's a bad risk, right? Mm-hmm. How do you start to get people to really start to say you need to have a forward view and the back data to think about this? How do you say, well, I know you have a lot of submissions coming at you all day long. By the way, they're coming from brokers who themselves are incentivized to bind as much business as quickly as possible, but they're not the ones carrying the balance sheet risk at the end of the day. So your interests are not always 100% aligned, and therefore how you price a risk is very different than where their motivation may be to bind the business. How do you train people to understand that that's kind of where we're at, and so we need to really take the time to think about things in a different way. So that's long-winded way, but I would say it's very much about, in some ways, starting to think about success across multiple vectors, starting to really get people to understand that the environment is shifting and is different from a risk landscape, and that it is therefore very, very important to understand that interface between human judgment and data and analytics and tools all needs to come together to inform better, faster decisions. And so how do we start to go from where we are to where we know we need to be? Ultimately, in my mind, people are the ultimate game changers here. And if you look at where there's the complete shortage today, I would say it's of talent that can think across, that can connect dots, that can kind of effectively, if you look at where the expertise is needed, it's across analytics, it's across data. You have people who train in data and analytics, but they don't necessarily train in the business. Yeah. How do you kind of connect those two things? So I keep coming back to that. So it's really a cultural challenge, but I think, again, I always say this, I think therein is the opportunity, just pendulum swing. And I think we swung probably too much into the micro, and I think that's good. We've learned a lot from that. Now we need to overlay on that sort of the fact that the macro risks matter as well. And so we need to be thinking about that today. I mean, look at CEO turnovers today, right? I mean, what it means to lead today in a company has shifted overall. And so it's a both and approach, I guess, is what I would say.
Fascinating, this relationship between human judgment and data when it comes to pricing risk in emerging areas such as cyber, and how to mitigate the impacts of such losses. You referred to Danny Kahneman's book, Noise, which was motivated by the fact that premiums varied quite a bit across underwriters. I suspect the variance is higher in new areas like cyber compared to auto.
ESG is a big buzzword these days. And, you hear a lot about that. Businesses are paying a lot of attention to it. And actually, I just had a conversation with a few days ago with a partner from McKinsey, and I asked him this question as well. You see a lot of businesses. Is this a buzzword or is it real? Are people gaming it and say, hey, look how good I am on ESG? And, his answer was kind of somewhat nuanced, as one would expect. And he said, there's a lot more awareness of the E part of the ESG. People are much more aware of that. How much they're doing about it varies a lot, a little less on the S, and I'll just punt on the G, part. So how do you look at this whole world of ESG?
So one, let me start by saying I think it is important, and we will talk a little bit about what I mean by the it. The reason I chuckle a little, when you've been around as long as you and I have, Vasant, we've seen many an acronym come and die, right? And we always know that acronyms, by their very nature, essentially are trying to capture nuance and complexity into a marketing sort of thing, right? A branding thing. So I laugh because I think about the term EM, right? Emerging markets. And I remember when emerging markets went to developing economies, and then there was BRICS. Remember when there was BRICS? Right. Yeah. And it was like, oh, but the BRICS are going to be different. And then it was like, and we sort of think about Brazil, Russia, India, China, right? Yeah. How are those four in the same acronym? So I laugh to simply, I make that point simply to say, we inherently try to simplify things, with buzzy things that are inherently complex and nuanced. So ESG are three fundamentally different things. Mm-hmm. They really are, yeah, right? Yeah. And where the maturity is on each one of those vectors is very different. And therefore, to be able to say, is ESG important or not, is kind of like saying, is it important to put salt in your food if you're baking something savory? And the answer is, yeah, it is, but it depends on how much. It depends on what you make, and you're right. So let's break that down. Let's start with the G, right? The G is governance. Who's going to sit here and dispute that governance isn't something that has been critical, right, to us in thinking about good risks versus bad risks? Who wouldn't say good management is better? Think about the number of papers written on why do U.S. companies consistently deliver higher profitability than those outside. Japan's a good kind of classic example. When U.S. management is compared to Japanese management, it boils down to management, right? Boils down to good governance. It boils down to, so governance has always been a key component that differentiates, right? It's a big factor in credit underwriting, right? So we'll put that one aside, right, yes, because we agree. So now let's go to social. Social is so nuanced. There's everything in there from, if you look at the UN definitions of what the S is, there's everything in there on your labor practices, right? All the way to, do customers buying your product understand what they're buying? Are you clear? Are you pricing appropriately? Are you giving the coverage that is required? For example, in our business, do they understand what they're paying for and what they're buying? And it has diversity, equity, and inclusion in it. And it has, right? So if you look at the S itself is so complex. So is it any wonder, right, that people generally are just afraid to tackle the S? So you hear a lot about the E. Yeah. The G people take as it's a given. Yeah. You don't hear much about the S. I bring that up simply to say that, like everything that is a marketing thing out there, you have to start by first asking yourself, what does this mean for me as a company? What are my values? And how am I going to define this? That's one lens. The second lens becomes, what's material? Right? Mm-hmm. Where's the materiality threshold here for however you define materiality? Is it reputation? Is it financial loss? Is it risk of stranded assets? Is it however you want to define it? But you have to look at it from, where are my values as a company? What do we stand for? What does our brand stand for? And where's the materiality kind of question? And then how do we start to define for ourselves, what is the E, what is the S, what is the G? And then how do we authentically say, can we deliver on that, right? So I'll give you the example of Liberty Mutual. As we sit here today, absolutely we have defined E, S, and G as an important, critical priority for our business, right? And we've defined it as through our lens of what our values are, right? One of our values is put people first, right? So for us, the S, there's a big component there of absolutely the regulators exist to make sure that we're pricing our products and the coverages and all of that, and that's all fair, right? That's always existed in our world. And DEI is really, really, really important to us, right? The diversity, equity, inclusion. How do you create a culture that actually attracts people with different perspectives of all walks of life in order to build this business of the future that we're talking about, because the old ways aren't going to get us where we need to get to. And then the environmental is our business. Like we just spent the last hour talking about climate, right? So it's our business. So I bring this up to say, again, I feel like we've overused the word I have overused the word dichotomizing at this point. But again, people talk about it's profit or it's, purpose, if you want to call it that, right? It's both, right? Generally, being a good citizen as a company is an important thing. That isn't new. But what that means and how you think about it and how you authentically kind of line up against it is really important.
So, Neeti, just to sort of wrap up here, right? You've had a really successful career coming to the U.S., when you were a kid. I'm an immigrant myself. I think this country has given a lot to both of us. What's your advice to young people these days, as they think about preparing for this future world, of increased volatility of all kinds?
It's definitely an interesting time, isn't it? Where you'd say Vasant, I have twin daughters who are teenagers, and I think about this question a lot, which is, am I even fit? Like, is my worldview even fit enough to guide these young souls through what the world is likely to look like and what they have to navigate between now and the next 20 years? I think about this a lot. My husband and I talk about this a lot, which is, are we even prepared? Because if you think about what young children today face, and you've written about this as well, the overload of information they get today versus when you and I were growing up. Good and bad information, and mostly the information that's out there tends to be sensationalized, right? And so there's that, but the filter on that is a lot less than it used to be before, when you and I were growing up. The other part of that is, as an immigrant coming to this country, so like I said, I grew up in India and in Kenya, and my dream, anyone's dream, my whole family's dream, was to make it to the U.S. Right? It was the land of milk and honey, and so I still remember the day my husband and I got sworn in as American citizens in New York down here, and we had tears in our eyes because it was a lifelong dream come true. And yet, over the past several years, you look at the arc of our country and you'd say, there's a lot of reasons why people are questioning our own values. And have we, and I struggle with this a little bit as an immigrant, because the promise of America, relative to everything I know, is still the best promise out there than anything else. And at the same time, there's a lot that we need to do that needs to kind of drive self-exploration as a country, as a people, to go from where we are to where we need to go to. So my advice, long-winded way of getting at that, because when my daughters say to me all day that they don't think I have much advice to give them, so take this with a truckload of salt. But my advice to young people is, read history, travel, meet as many people, go out and meet people. Being on Instagram is not meeting people. Go out and meet people. Get curious. Ask lots of questions. Get interested. Get passionate about something. I feel like we've lost that aspect of getting excited and passionate about something and just going after it. And so that's what I would say, because...
Do you think rising expectations has something to do with it? I mean, I remember when I came here, I had zero expectations. I expected to be treated badly. It's just like, that's just the way it is. People just treat, you're a new arrival, well, you're treated badly, right? So it was just something that you accepted, right? And, I was just joking with someone the other day about, how people weren't proper, right? I lived with with roommates who were, philosophers, and they'd say the most, what we consider the most inappropriate things these days, but that was okay. It was kind of, you didn't expect much. So, but I feel like people's expectations are much higher than they used to be, and they should be. I mean,
I think that's the key. They should be, right? There's sort of an element of, did we all sort of just accept that this is the way it is, and this is the prevailing kind of way, and we need to fit in. Exactly. We just need to fit in, versus you're being invited to now have a seat at the table and have a voice. And so, yes, expectations are higher, and I think we are the better for it, because they should be. That says we want to change and we want to be better. And that is a fantastic thing, which is why I come back to, I'd rather be here in this country being invited to that conversation, right? That is progress. And that is a good thing. So yes, expectations are higher, and yet some things are the same, aren't they? We each are, in some ways, you would say, people are having more identity crises than ever before, right? Part of the expectations, in my mind, part of what came with acceptance was, you just get on with it.
Yeah, indeed. On that note, Neeti, it's been fascinating. Thanks so much. I learned a lot, and thanks for your time. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Oh my goodness, it was such a pleasure, Vasant. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here.